Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the third in a series that the Scottish Council on Archives is running on the theme of archives and records, particularly in the time of COVID-19. The speaker today that I'm going to be talking to is Anthea Seles. Anthea is Secretary General of the International Council on Archives. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to her today from Edinburgh, where Anthea is in Paris. So Anthea, we live in interesting times, and I'd like to talk to you about the impact on the archives and records sector of COVID-19, and also the opportunities and challenges it presents for the sector.
Absolutely.
But I wonder, before we begin, maybe you could just talk a little bit about your role, because the International Council of Archives, as I understand it, is a body that represents archivists all over the world.
That's correct. Well, firstly, thank you so much, John, for asking me to participate in the podcast series for the SCA. It's been brilliant, and I'm looking forward to today. So a bit about the ICA. So the ICA is, of course, as you said, an international body that represents archives and archivists from around the world. And the goal of ICA is to advocate for archives internationally, provide a forum for archivists and archives internationally to exchange on best practice, share knowledge, and discuss on current and emerging events. And it's also about sort of facilitating respect for cultural diversity and also different archival practices from around the world. We have 4 different types of membership categories. So we have our national archives. Then we've got a section for a category for professional associations, such as SCA, one for organizations, and then finally one for individuals and students. So those are the different types of institutions and organizations we represent. And we also work collaboratively with many of our international partners in data management, digital preservation, and the documentary heritage sector.
And that's really interesting. And what do you find are the shared areas of major concern? What are the major issues that affect archivists, no matter where they're from around the world?
I think the major concern is about the importance of the profession. And the value that the profession brings, which we'll I think unpack over the course of this this podcast around COVID and the value of the profession within COVID and response to COVID. And that's a concern across the piece. I worked in Africa for a number of years, particularly in East Africa was really the area that I worked the most in. And I hear it as well from professionals, as I've been Secretary General from around the world. It's about the value of the work of the archivist, and I would say records managers as well, because we have different concepts of where in the chain the archivist intervenes, and in different parts of the world it starts from the very beginning, and then you've got the records management community as well in different parts of the world that intervene much earlier in the process, which we can get into. I'm not gonna talk too much about it just yet, but I think it's really about valuing the profession, valuing the expertise that the profession brings. So when I worked particularly in Africa, there were certain parts of Africa that used records management and archives actually as a punishment. So when somebody did unwell, when somebody was not doing particularly well in a given position, they would use that as a mechanism of demotion, which essentially completely devalued the work and the expertise and the importance of that profession within that particular country. Or it wasn't recognized as a professional, sort of what they would call a cadre, or a recognized profession that had qualifications that you had to have in order to exercise the function of records manager or archivist. So that was surprising, particularly when I was in Africa, but I think it speaks to a wider misunderstanding about what archivists and records managers do, and what it is that we bring to the table when especially in times like these, when information becomes so incredibly important.
Yes, and as you know, in May, the ICA, along with a number of other international organizations, including the World Data System, the Digital Preservation Coalition, and the Research Data Alliance, were co-signatories of a fairly important statement that said, amongst other things, that the duty to document this information, and referring to the information and data in the time of COVID-19, this duty to document does not cease in a crisis, becomes more essential than ever. And I wondered, why do you think that now, at this particular moment in history, that the duty to document is more essential than ever. And given what you've just said about the role of the archivist in society, which it maybe is different in different countries in terms of its prominence or the respect that it's given. Why do you think that duty document isn't now more essential than ever? And what role does the archivist have in fulfilling that duty?
So I think, I think the role of the archivist and records manager is essential at any point in time. But I think during these times of crisis, they become, I would say, even more important because governments are making these, and it's expressed in the statement, governments are making these wide-ranging, hugely impactful policy decisions. Different sectors are involved with developing vaccines that have an impact on human lives, and also measuring things like the economic impact of what COVID will bring. And you have to have accurate information for that. I think back to Laura Miller, who you did I think one of the first podcasts with around the value of evidence in an information age. Well, this type of evidence is even more critical now. And I think it is too, the duty to document becomes more important, especially now with COVID, because I'm not meaning to disparage remote working, but we've had to flip over to remote working incredibly quickly. Many institutions went from, and myself included, one day we were in the office and the next day we were in, shelter in place or a lockdown in our homes. And it's trying to make sure that the decisions that we make during this time, whether it's ICA or whether it's a government or whether it's a pharmaceutical company, those decisions are properly documented to demonstrate, one, the impact of what was being discussed at the time, what were the concerns, in government, and I would say in the research sector, how these decisions are being arrived at. Too often, and previous to COVID, there was, I would say, a real misunderstanding about why record keeping was important. It was seen as a rearguard action. Normally, it became important when there was a crisis or when somebody gets pulled up in front of a parliamentary committee or some type of government oversight committee. Then it became important to have record keeping. And then they often came, so I worked at National Archives UK before being at ICA. And that's oftentimes when they came to the archives and started asking for advice on record keeping and what they can do and helping find the information. But at that point, it's too late. And so I think with the statement, what we're trying to do is we are trying to remind all the different sectors involved that are having these making these major decisions that impact on people's lives, their livelihoods, their health, that you need to be reminded. You have a duty to ensure that all of this information is being captured and that it doesn't have to be in paper. There is still a perception that archives are dusty paper records, and that is absolutely not the case. That's why we asked Research Data Alliance, Digital Preservation Coalition, World Data Systems, UNESCO as well, to be signatories to sort of show that it's a much more complex landscape that we're working with at this time. And we also can't forget about emerging technologies that will likely be involved in vaccine development or in government policy decisions such as artificial intelligence. And all of these things need to be documented. And so it was really that sort of call to say, work from home, but be sure that you are capturing that information in as best you can. I think that you really have to take into account the constraints that certain systems, third-party systems, put in place, which could be a whole nother podcast. But it's sort of looking at then what is pragmatic in this instance, and how do we make sure that that's properly captured and preserved.
Well, what you're saying is really interesting, because I think, as you're pointing out, that the role of record keepers has really come to the fore during this crisis. Here in Scotland, during the daily briefing from the First Minister, she quotes the latest statistics and data from the National Records of Scotland. So, we're being led by the science, but we're also very much being led by the evidence that is being captured by record keepers. And you mentioned, that for many people, the practice of archiving or records management is seen as a rearguard action, but here it is very much, brought to the fore. So does that mean that this current crisis, it gives us an opportunity for promoting wider appreciation of the roles of archivists and records managers, or maybe that's not important? Well, I wondered what you thought about that.
I think it's absolutely critically important now. I don't think we can underestimate what it is we bring to the table. I know that, in the profession, there's been a lot of people asking me, and in conversations I've been having with colleagues about, well, what is the value of archives? What is the value of my profession in these times of crisis when people are dying and when the situation is so dire? And my response is, our profession is even more critical now. It's even more important because you know what? You know who's going to be capturing that information? It's us. Nobody else is doing it. Everybody else is thinking about I'm not saying what other people are thinking about is not important. It absolutely is, because we need to take care of people. We need to take care of their livelihoods. We need to take care of their lives. But who is behind that, making sure that, that information is documented, that information is captured, and we have the expertise for that. Nobody else has that expertise. And I don't mean to devalue, what our colleagues in the library community or in the data management community bring. It's archivists that are doing that. It's records managers that are doing that. And that is the role that we play. And that is the role that we are trained to play, and that we received, our educations for, whether that's through a formal system or through informal networks, because we learn as we go on the job. So I think that now it is even more important to ensure that this information is documented. And I'm hoping that it provides that platform then for archivists, because I know it's a struggle. I know we're not always invited to the table. But I think it's then the role that we play now. How can we sort of use what we've done to really reinforce about what it is that we do and why the profession is important, and help organizations improve their response or their ways of working, enabling people to work from home a bit more, while still ensuring that information is captured, or ensuring that governments are able, or institutions in general, are better able to respond to situations in crisis like this.
Well, the sector has always known how important it is, and this current crisis, as we said, is really emphasising the important role that records keeping and collection of evidence is. The statement that we talked about that was released in May also says that we, the signatories of the statement, call on governments, businesses and research institutions around the world to document their decisions and transactions now and for the future. And obviously that's extraordinarily important. Is the reality that no one's really listening to that their concerns are political or economic or whatever, but the archivist's voice perhaps is not being heard? Is that a danger?
Absolutely. And I'm not going to say that it isn't. I think, but I think that's where trying to look at what it is we brought now to try and create that platform for advocacy, and to try and show that there is something good we bring to the table. I think we're too often, and I've been having conversations with colleagues to see how we can get more media coverage around the statement and around the work that archives are doing in the time of COVID. And some of the first questions that members of the news community or the journalists ask is, what are the bad news stories? But I'm like, well, no, yes, okay, there's bad news stories. That's the reality. I could cite a laundry list of bad news stories around what happens when information management goes wrong. What I want to emphasize is, what is the good news story here? What is it that we can do ahead of time to bring to really do if you will, in sort of business or government parlance, what is the value add that we bring? I don't simply want to focus on what happens when it all goes horribly wrong, because at that point it's too late. What I want to do is I want to talk about why we should be involved from the beginning, why we should be sitting at the table when it comes to development of IT systems, computer software, policy, developing, the work processes for policy, or developing research, research sort of frameworks where data is collected and how it is maintained. That's where we should be, not at the end of the process when we're sitting here trying to kind of help people when there's a crisis, find information that they need, which they should have documented from the beginning. So that, I think, for me is that where I feel we need to position ourselves.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think that the role of the records keeper is really important in terms of maintaining social justice, human rights, and ultimately accountability. And I wanted to ask you, does documentation, collection of evidence, by government institutions and their records managers actually really lead to accountability, or is there something else at play here? Does it really depend more on the transparency and openness of the state and of the governments in charge?
I would say yes and no. So we have governments that would hold themselves up as transparent, but you present them with evidence and they pretend that it doesn't exist or it's incorrect. So I would say that accountability, I think, still has a role. I think it's about having a trustworthy source of information, making sure that information is accurate. And I think too, it depends at what level. You can have accountability with a big A, which would be holding the entire government to account or holding a sector to account, and accountability with a small a, which is the ability of citizens to assert their rights. The ability, for example, when I was working in Africa, about the ability of citizens to get access to their pension, because there were instances where the information was properly kept, and because it was properly kept, and they could then come back to government and say, or they had the information they needed to then come back to government and say, well, I worked for government for X number of years, and so therefore I can now claim my pension. So, it's a difficult question to answer, because yes, there are governments that are not transparent, and that, how do you hold a government that isn't necessarily transparent or democratic to account? I think we're seeing examples right now in the world where that is it's complicated, and it's not an easy sort of, there's no easy answer to this. But I think, one of the things when I run up against situations like this, where you're potentially dealing with governments that are not transparent, it's that the archivist is there to document. There's always the hope that these governments will become more open or more democratic, or have a system of government that allows citizens to be free, and that the archives are there as sort of after the fact to say, well, this is what happened, and this is how we come to grips with some of the atrocities or some of the human rights violations that have occurred. We look at restorative justice, we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have happened in the world, and these processes cannot happen without archives. And so that's sort of a type of accountability that may come after. It may not be immediate. It may not enable citizens within the here and now, with the systems that they're working with, to say to government, you have made a poor decision that has impacted people's lives. Or you, industry, have done all of these horrible things, and now you must be held responsible, or you must account for why you did the things that you did. And it may not come. It may not come in 5 years. It may not come in 20 years. It may come in 100 years. It may come in 250 years. But then again, that is where the value of the archivist is, in terms of being there as much as possible to receive that information, safeguard that information, and then hold it in safekeeping until society is ready to be able, or have the ability to be able, to hold institutions responsible for what has happened.
Yeah, in Scotland, we refer to archives as, I'm sure it's not peculiar to Scotland, but it's the documented memory of the nation. And we've talked a little bit about how archives and records are important in terms of their immediate benefit to society at a time of crisis, such as we're living through at the moment. But also their long-term benefit and importance. I wanted just to talk a little bit about a statement that was released by UNESCO in April, a statement which ICA supports, which talked about turning the threat of COVID-19 into an opportunity for greater support for documentary heritage. So, we've been talking about collecting, immediate data and immediate evidence, but there's also a lot being done now to collect stories, that stories of people who are living through COVID-19, and the statement, the UNESCO statement talks about the support for documentary heritage and refers to memory institutions such as archives, libraries, museums, etc., as needing particular support. In the context of the importance of archives and records, why do you think those memory institutions need particular support?
Because, and I think we kind of mentioned this a bit earlier, which is that they're not the most valued institutions when in times of crisis. Culture is not valued in these instances, and when it comes to, and when we look at what, we don't know what the economic fallout yet of COVID will be, and oftentimes when you're looking at where to cut your budget, when after you've had this type of a healthcare crisis, are you going to cut in health? No, you're going to cut somewhere like culture. You're going to cut in some of where it's perceived as having less value. It's perceived as having less impact in the immediate term. But the problem is because we play that longer term role, it has a real effect on what we can do and the resources then that we can apply as institutions to ensure this analysis of the situation and to hopefully learn lessons. I saw on I had a Facebook a friend who had posted something about the 1908 pandemic and how even in the 1908 pandemic, this huge issue with masks, people not wanting to wear masks after a huge and global pandemic, they were objecting to it and they were having protests about it. And I just said, but it's thanks to the fact that archives have that ability to preserve, but we need the resources to do it. And too often, as I said, it's when you're looking at where to make the cuts in order to keep government afloat, those are usually the first places that you start to cut back on. And I think that's what also UNESCO is trying to underscore is that, you need to ensure that these institutions are properly resourced in as much as we possibly can. Like, we understand that we're going to have to, as we say in French, serrer les ceintures. We're going to have to tighten our belts. But be cognizant of the fact of the important role that libraries, museums, and archives have in ensuring the availability of that information for future study, hopefully, I hope, to learn lessons around what happened at this time.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, I would agree with you entirely. In my role as director of the Scottish Council on Archives, I'm very much see myself and my organisation as being a strong advocate for the role of archivists and records managers, and obviously that's an important part of your role in an international context. And as we both know, and you've just articulated extremely well, the archivists and record managers, they tend to be overlooked or tend to be regarded as something that can be cut back at the best of times. But we're now in the worst of times, and I wondered, apart from the obvious, economic threats to jobs, to budgets, that it's not peculiar to archivists. I mean, all sectors will be suffering from this. But I wonder, are there any other particular threats that this current crisis, any other challenges that the sector might face or is currently facing it?
I think, and I think we've seen it recently, and it was picked up probably in one of your earlier podcasts, is the question of manipulation of information after the fact. I think we've seen it all over the world, sort of I've said one thing, but now I'm going to say something completely opposite. And pretend that I didn't say the first thing, and I think that is the fear, especially in a digital age. And thankfully, we have institutions like Internet Archives that capture these things, or I don't know if Library of Congress is still capturing tweets or not, but that we have these institutions in place that are there to kind of counteract that. But I think that is the other danger that the community faces in terms of, because we aren't necessarily seen as people who sit at the table, that, how do we flag when there are instances where information potentially has been manipulated to affect public perception, to affect public opinion, or to change potentially change the justification of how decisions were arrived at or made. It's not unheard of previous to COVID, but I think there is increasingly that danger in this particular instance, because governments have just reacted to COVID, and so they've had to make quick decisions. For valid reasons, I think that a lot of the industries and a lot of the governments around the world just didn't know how to handle this and have had to sort of manage quickly. But that doesn't mean after the fact that you get to manipulate the information and change the story, because it's an inconvenient truth for you. You did the best that you could in some instances. In other instances, maybe not. But then you have to face facts and face the situation as it stands. But I think that's where the danger for the community is right now.
Yeah, and I would agree. And the whole issue of data manipulation is something obviously that was very important and of great concern before COVID-19. I talked to both Laura Miller and William Kilbride from Digital Preservation Coalition in my last two podcasts about this whole issue of data manipulation. Mm-hmm. And there are terms that are being bandied about just now, post-truth, mm-hmm. fake news, alternative facts. And it seems what that really is about is it's about placing a blanket of mistrust over evidence, mm-hmm. over objective facts, and instead asking people to, trust emotion more than evidence. And I wondered what you thought about that, and what is the relationship between the role of the archivists and the records managers and actual objective evidence, and how ultimately can we trust that evidence?
I would say it's for us to really build the platform to be trust, like institutions that carry information that is factual, and I wouldn't, that is a representation that is fact. I think we need to build relationships, and I think because we're in a world, and I think, as you rightly pointed out, where you could present something that's completely factual and somebody will turn around and say, no, it's not. And the person who says, no, it's not, is believed. And so I think it's really about, again, for me, it's about building relationships so that we can work with communities that have a trust base. At this point in time, I think my question would be, who is a trusted community? Because I don't think anybody is really a trusted community at this point, at least from the perception of certain segments of the population. So it feels like you can't trust media. It feels like you can't trust experts. It feels like you can't really trust what anybody says. I don't mean to be cavalier or trite about it, but that's kind of how it feels like as I read the news, as I watch things unfold all over the world, and I'm thinking, well, there's something that's, somebody has said something patently false. And nobody's challenging this. Like, no, everybody's just like, it's false, but then nothing, there's no and then. And so what is, the role of the archivist here, I think, is about being that stalwart bastion of this is, staying there, being the documentor, but also I would argue that there is a role for archivists around and records managers for saying that is false. That is not true. I think that it brings with it, however, a lot of danger to put the profession in that context, particularly in the world that we're living in now, which is why I feel that we need to build those partnerships with, journalists, with newspapers that present facts. I think that's another point, and that have perhaps some level of trust, and working with these experts that can act as a sort of our champions of trust within other communities. But there's no easy answer to that, especially not in this day and age that we're facing. But I think it's about how do we build those partnerships, because there are services out there that are fact-checking services that help to try and bring a level of truth, if you will, to the public discourse in this day and age. But it's complicated, and but I still feel that the profession definitely has a role to play here. It's just, I think we need to carve out what that role is, it looks like. I think we talk about ourselves sometimes as holders of fact and evidence, but how do we more manifestly play that role in society today? Because there is the passive documentation element, but I think there's a more active role we can play. And I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm still sort of thinking about what that might be.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, back to, for example, propaganda during the Second World War. So, propaganda posters, propaganda leaflets, propaganda literature would have been collected and catalogued, and we can now look back on it. And there's so much information mixed up with misinformation, swirling about just now. And the archivist's role is always to try and make decisions on what to collect and what to catalogue. But they have decisions to make now in terms of evaluating what is or should be preserved at a time where information and data, is being manipulated and misused, and it's difficult, as you say, to know what to trust. And I wonder, is this having an actual negative impact on the practice of archivists? Are they themselves, struggling now to know how to capture something that is objective, that people could look back on in the future?
I think we need to. I think this needs to be, discussed with more within the profession. I think for a long time we viewed ourselves as these impartial collectors. We're not impartial. We have a worldview, and that worldview sometimes gets implicitly, latently reflected in some of the appraisal and selection decisions that we make. And I think we need to be more upfront with that. And I don't necessarily believe, and I'm sure the community will disagree with me, but I don't necessarily believe we really have plumbed that at this point, that we really have had a truly honest conversation about ourselves, about how do we document that and how do we make our own biases apparent. And that doesn't mean that what we collect is less truthful, but we do observe the organization through through our own sort of frames of reference, and that's okay. That's life, and I think we can try and be as objective as we possibly can. So a lot of us use things like, functional analysis to try and look at how functions move across different organizations, and that's one way of doing it. But sometimes it's a personal call. It's a call based on our opinions, based on information we've got in our heads about organizations and how things work. And I think, because people don't understand what we do, there is that potential of implicit distrust, or the view that we are playing a role to facilitate untoward or illicit actions, that we're part of a broader process. And it's not easy to deconstruct that, right? I've faced that many times as an archivist, where I've been seen as participating in decisions to suppress information, when sometimes it's not me that's making that decision. I'm inside advocating for truth, for openness, for transparency. And sometimes an organization is not open to those types of discourses or those types of conversations. And it's quite challenging as an archivist sometimes, because you want to do the right thing. You want to be able to document in as much as you can. And sometimes that's not, you run up against these barriers where I have documented things that I probably should have documented and kept them in the archives, because I felt that for the sake of transparency at a later point in time, this needed to be brought to the fore. But it wasn't possible to do it at the time. So I think there's a duality to, the role of archivist in a time of post-truth, and also acknowledging our own biases in that, and how do we explain that to people, and how do we, in a way that they won't compromise the trust of the majority. And I don't know that we've really plumbed that.
Yeah, I think this is throwing up a whole lot of really interesting issues, which I think could probably form the basis of another complete podcast. Because what really you're talking about there is the person behind the archivist.
Yeah.
Are archivists, should they be anonymous? Should they be neither seen nor heard, or is that impossible? Because at the end of the day, they're people. And that brings me on to my final point I wanted to discuss with you, Anthea. COVID-19, ultimately it's a human tragedy, but it's the individual stories, it's the people that resonate with other people,
Yeah.
and not just now, but will do in the future, much more than the cold data and the bare facts. And given what you've just said, and I think I kind of understand where you're coming from. What I was going to ask you was, is it the role of the archivist to objectively capture and care for these stories and memories? And I think the answer is, in terms of that, the archivist's own morality has to come to play.
Yeah.
But I wonder also, does the humanity of the record keeper play a part too in capturing those stories and memories for current and future generations?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the historical record is more resonant when you can identify with the people in it. So I think the human factor, whether in the record itself has such an impact on how people can appreciate what's going on. If I had seen, so just as an example, if I had seen that 1918 poster about masks before COVID, I'd have been like, sure, okay, that's fine. But now being in this situation, living through this, and now I have, and looking at this whole discussion about, 1918 pandemic and the use of masks, I have a completely different appreciation for it because I'm living it. I'm living it now. I think that we cannot, as archivists, disassociate ourselves from the emotional impact that the record has on us, and living in these historical times. When I worked on the Truth and Reconciliation work in Canada as a religious archivist for the Roman Catholic Church, I think we try and play the impartial card, but the records have, and it's coming to the fore more and more about the traumatic impact that some of these records can have on us as people. And I don't think we can, and I know the association, the Association of Australian Archivists has developed a course on this, on managing trauma in an archives and the emotional impact of these types of events on us as human beings working in an institution that has to document sometimes really horrible human tragedies. And I don't think you can ever disassociate yourself from that. And it's that we as a profession, I don't know that we have really been very good at acknowledging the impact of the records that we deal with on us as people. The work that I did on Truth and Reconciliation and some of the things I read, have had a deep impact on me as an archivist and as a person. I know that, people now, archivists now and archivists in the future will look at those pandemic records, and it's going to have a huge impact on them. And so, I don't think you can disassociate that in any way, shape, or form, because we live in the world, we experience the world, and these things have an effect on us. And I think it's, how do we help our profession? How do we help the people in our profession as we move through these, not only dealing with historically effective records, but going through this situation now?
Well, that's a really powerful statement that you've made, Anthea. And here in the UK, every Thursday, members of the public are invited to stand at their front doors and clap for NHS workers and carers. And it seems to me that archivists and records managers are key workers. And wouldn't it be wonderful at some point that people could come out and clap for the work that archivists and record managers do? Because I think it's extraordinarily important. Absolutely. So I just want to end now by thanking you, Anthea, and thank you for all the work that you're doing at the International Council of Archives and talking to me today. It's been really absolutely fascinating, and I hope that people will listen to this podcast, and you and I and all our colleagues in the sector, throughout the world, can do our utmost to raise the profile of the role of archives and records managers, which are so important, particularly during this time of crisis. So thank you very much, Anthea.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for having me. And I wish all the best to you and to all of the archives in the Scottish Council on Archives and all the archives around the world. Please be assured of ICU support, and if you need us, we're here.
That's really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.